The autumn wind swept through the grounds of Ashford estate with a mournful whisper, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, and in the grey light of late afternoon, the grand manor stood like a monument to old wealth and older prejudices, its stone facade cold and imposing against the darkening sky. Eleanor moved through the servants' corridor with practiced quietness, her hands raw from the morning's washing, her back aching from the weight she carried, not merely the child growing within her swollen belly, but the burden of whispered judgments that followed her like shadows through every room she entered. She felt their eyes upon her always, the other servants, their gazes a mixture of pity and contempt, their voices dropping to conspiratorial murmurs whenever she passed, and though she kept her head high and her expression serene, each whispered word landed like a stone against her heart. Shameful, she had heard Mrs. Pemberton mutter that morning, the head housekeeper's lips pursed with righteous disapproval. A girl of decent family, fallen so low. One wonders what her poor father would think, God rest his soul. Eleanor had said nothing, had merely continued folding the linens with steady hands, though her fingers trembled slightly and her throat tightened with unshed tears. The household had made its judgment of her months ago when her condition became impossible to hide a maid who had strayed, a cautionary tale, a woman who had surrendered her virtue and now carried the evidence of her sin for all to see. That they did not know the truth, could not imagine the truth, was a mercy and a torment in equal measure. Lady Ashford's disdain cut deepest of all, the Duke's mother regarding Eleanor with an icy contempt that seemed to lower the temperature of any room they shared. Just that morning, her ladyship had passed Eleanor in the corridor and paused, her elegant features arranged in an expression of aristocratic disgust. "How unfortunate," she had said, her voice carrying just far enough to ensure the nearby servants would hear, "that standards have fallen so drastically. In my day, such creatures would never have been permitted to remain under a respectable roof." Eleanor had curtsied, her eyes downcast, her face burning with humiliation, and had whispered, "My lady," before Lady Ashford swept past in a rustle of expensive silk, leaving the sharp scent of French perfume and sharper judgment in her wake. Now, as Eleanor made her way toward the kitchen to assist with the evening preparations, she heard the commotion at the front of the house, the clatter of horses, the call of footmen, the sudden energy that signaled an important arrival, and her heart stuttered in her chest because she knew, somehow she knew, that Alexander had returned from London earlier than expected, and the careful distance they had maintained these past months was about to collapse under the weight of proximity and all the unspoken truths that hung between them like morning mist. 2 years before that autumn afternoon, Eleanor had stood in the modest parlour of her family's townhouse, the room stripped nearly bare by creditors, the walls pale where paintings had once hung, and she had understood with the clarity that comes from desperation that she was watching everything her father had built crumble to dust in her trembling hands. The consumption had taken him slowly, draining first his strength and then their savings, as Eleanor spent everything on physicians and medicines that offered hope but delivered only encheed the inevitable, and when he finally slipped away on a rain-soaked April morning, he left behind nothing but debts, and a daughter of gentle birth but no prospects, no dowry, no male relation to ensure her protection or secure her future. The letters from creditors arrived daily, each one more threatening than the last, and Eleanor had sold first the silver, then the furniture, then her mother's jewelry, everything of value, piece by piece, until the house itself stood hollow and echoing, a shell waiting to be claimed by the bank that held the mortgage her father had taken in those final, desperate months. She had applied for positions as a governess, a companion, even a shop girl, but her applications went unanswered or were rejected with polite regret, and as the final eviction notice arrived, Eleanor had stood at her bedroom window watching the autumn leaves fall and wondered with a strange, distant calm where exactly one went when one had nowhere left to go. It was then that the Duke of Ashford's card had arrived, delivered by a discreet footman, requesting the honour of a private audience, and Eleanor had received him in that bare parlour with her chin high and her hands folded to hide their shaking, expecting some final humiliation, perhaps an offer of the sort desperate men sometimes made to desperate women. Instead, Alexander Ashford had stood before her fireplace, tall and austere in his perfectly tailored coat, his dark eyes unreadable, and had spoken words she could scarcely comprehend. A proposal of marriage, legal and binding, conducted in absolute secrecy, with the understanding that she would live within his household as a servant, that their union would remain unknown to society, that her singular purpose would be to provide him with an heir, and in exchange he would settle all her debts, ensure her material needs were met, and grant her the protection of his name, even if she could never publicly bear it. Eleanor had stared at him as though he spoke a foreign language, her mind struggling to reconcile the enormity of what he offered with the cold, transactional manner in which he offered it, and when she finally found her voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" He had regarded her for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing, before answering, "Because I require an heir but refuse to trap a woman of my own station in a loveless union for the sake of duty, and because you require rescue and I am in a position to provide it, and because this arrangement, however unconventional, serves us both." She should have refused, and should have been insulted by the presumption, should have clung to whatever shreds of pride remained to her, but as she looked around that empty room and thought of the streets that awaited her come morning, Eleanor had heard herself say, "I accept," and had watched something flicker in Alexander Ashford's eyes, relief, perhaps, or recognition, or something she could not name, before he nodded once, "Precisely," and replied, "The ceremony will be arranged for Friday next, in the chapel at dawn, and you will take up residence in the servants' quarters the following day." And with those words, Eleanor's fate was sealed, her future bound to a man she did not know, in a marriage that could never be acknowledged. And she had not known then whether she was being saved or damned, only that the choice, such as it was, had already been made. The chapel stood small and grey in the pre-dawn mist, its ancient stones cold beneath Eleanor's fingertips as she steadied herself against the doorframe. Her wedding dress, if it could be called, such a simple gown of pale blue, borrowed from a cousin who had not asked too many questions, and her hands trembled so violently that she had to clasp them together to still their shaking as she crossed the threshold into the dim interior, where candles flickered like uncertain hope against the encroaching darkness. Alexander waited before the altar with the priest, a man whose discretion had apparently been purchased along with his services, and when Eleanor's eyes met the Duke's across that sacred space, she saw in his expression the same careful blankness he had worn during their first meeting, a mask of composure that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those dark eyes. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of Latin phrases and mumbled responses, Eleanor's voice barely audible as she repeated words that bound her irrevocably to this man, this stranger, this cold arrangement dressed in the vestments of sacrament. And when Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band, nothing ornate, nothing that might draw attention, she felt the weight of it, like a shackle, even as some traitorous part of her heart whispered that it was also an anchor, a tether to something solid in a world that had become untethered and adrift. Alexander's hand, when he took hers to speak his vows, was warm and steady, and Eleanor found herself clinging to that steadiness as the only solid thing in a moment that felt dreamlike and surreal. And when the priest pronounced them man and wife, Alexander's fingers tightened briefly around hers in what might have been reassurance, or might have been nothing more than the conclusion of a business transaction successfully executed. They departed the chapel separately, Alexander first, and Eleanor waiting a quarter hour before following, and she walked back through the awakening streets of London with a gold band hidden in her glove, and the knowledge that she was now a duchess who would never be addressed as such, a wife who would sleep in servants' quarters, a woman legally bound to a man who would treat her as a stranger in all public spaces. That evening, Alexander came to the small room he had arranged for her in a boarding house, where she would stay until the household was prepared for her arrival, and what passed between them, in that shadowed space, was clinical and efficient. A duty performed with as much detachment as could be managed under such intimate circumstances, yet Eleanor could not help but notice the moments when his touch gentled, when his eyes sought hers with something that might have been concern, when his hand steadied her trembling shoulder and remained there a moment longer than strictly necessary. He did not speak during the act itself, but afterward, as he dressed in the darkness, he had paused at the door and said quietly, without turning to face her, "I will ensure you want for nothing, Eleanor, and I will never ask of you more than we have agreed upon." and she had lain in the narrow bed listening to his footsteps fade down the hall, and wondered why those words, meant as comfort, felt instead like a door closing on possibilities she had not known she harbored until the moment they were foreclosed. 3 days later, she had entered Ashford estate through the servants' entrance, carrying a single worn valise, and had become invisible in the way that servants were always invisible to the quality, and Alexander had passed her in the corridor that first morning without acknowledgement, though she had seen his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and had understood that this pretense would exact its cost from both of them in ways neither had anticipated when they spoke their vows in that cold chapel at dawn. The autumn rain fell in grey sheets against the windows of Ashford estate as Eleanor moved through the corridors with her arms laden with fresh linens, her swollen belly making each step an exercise in careful balance, and she could feel the weight of eyes upon her wherever she went, the other servants watching with a mixture of pity and contempt, their whispered conversations falling silent as she approached, only to resume the moment she passed. And she had learned not to acknowledge the gossip, not to respond to the thinly veiled insults disguised as concern, not to show any reaction when Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, assigned her the most physically demanding tasks with a smile that never reached her cold eyes. The child within her had begun to move with increasing vigor, small flutters that became insistent kicks, and Eleanor found herself placing a protective hand over her belly during those brief moments when she was alone in the servants' corridors, whispering wordless reassurances to the life growing inside her, even as she wondered what future awaited. A child born into such circumstances, acknowledged by its father only in secret, carried by a mother who existed in a strange liminal space between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Lady Ashford's disdain had crystallized into something sharper in recent weeks, the Duke's mother watching Eleanor with narrowed eyes during those rare moments when their paths crossed, and Eleanor had learned to keep her gaze lowered and her movements deferential whenever the Dowager Duchess swept through the servants' areas on her inspections, though she could feel the older woman's scrutiny like a physical weight, and sensed that Lady Ashford suspected something beyond the obvious scandal of a pregnant servant, some significance that Eleanor represented but could not openly acknowledge. It was in the hallways that Eleanor's carefully maintained composure faced its greatest test, those moments when Alexander passed her on his way to the library or the study, and when protocol demanded, she'd press herself against the wall and lower her eyes in deference. And yet, in those brief seconds, their gazes would meet and hold, and she would see in his dark eyes a question, a concern, an intensity that made her heart stutter in her chest, even as her rational mind insisted. This was merely the practical interest of a man monitoring his investment, ensuring the health of his unborn heir. He never spoke to her in those encounters, never acknowledged her beyond the barest nod that any gentleman might offer to household staff, but Eleanor had begun to notice the subtle tension in his jaw when he saw her carrying heavy loads, the way his hands would flex at his sides as though restraining himself from some impulse, the manner in which his gaze would linger on her face for a fraction longer than propriety demanded, and she found herself both dreading and anticipating those hallway meetings with an intensity that frightened her in its implications. The other servants assumed the worst, of course, their speculation ranging from the mundane that Eleanor had been seduced and abandoned by some tradesman or footman, to the more salacious theories whispered in the scullery after the household had retired, and Eleanor endured their judgment with the same quiet dignity she brought to all her trials, understanding that any defense would only fuel further speculation, and that silence, however painful, remained her only protection. At night, alone in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Eleanor would lie awake listening to the rain against the roof and feeling the child move within her, and she would touch the simple gold band she wore on a chain beneath her shift, hidden from all eyes, and wonder if Alexander ever lay awake in his grand chamber on the floor above thinking of her, of their strange arrangement, of the child that would bind them forever even as the world conspired to keep them apart. And she would tell herself that such thoughts were foolish, that she must not confuse a business transaction with anything deeper, even as her treacherous heart insisted on hoping for something she could not name and dared not voice. The changes began so subtly that Eleanor almost missed them in those first weeks, and small shifts in the household's rhythm that seemed unremarkable until she stood back and observed the pattern emerging like a constellation, slowly revealing itself against the night sky. And it was Mrs. Henderson, who first drew her attention to the alterations when the head housekeeper grudgingly reassigned Eleanor to lighter duties. Dusting the library, organizing the linen closets, tasks that required less physical strain, claiming with barely concealed resentment that these were the Duke's explicit instructions regarding any servant in Eleanor's condition. Though Eleanor noticed she was the only pregnant maid to receive such consideration, she found the first book on a Thursday afternoon while organizing the small sitting room adjacent to the main library, a worn copy of Wordsworth's poems placed precisely on the corner of a side table where no book had rested the day before, and when she opened it, her breath caught because she recognized it as the same edition her father had read to her as a child, the same collection she had mentioned once to Alexander during their brief conversation before the wedding when he had asked about her interests, and she had spoken of poetry with an enthusiasm she could not quite suppress. The volume appeared to have been placed there intentionally, away from the main shelves, in a location where only someone dusting that particular room would discover it. And Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages and found a pressed flower marking her favorite poem, Tintern Abbey, and she understood with a clarity that made her heart ache that Alexander had been listening during that conversation, had remembered her words across the months of silence and separation, and had found a way to give her this gift without drawing attention or requiring acknowledgement. More books appeared in the weeks that followed, always in places where Eleanor worked alone, always editions of works she had mentioned or authors she admired, and she began to find them with an anticipation she tried to convince herself was merely intellectual curiosity rather than the dangerous flutter of hope that accompanied each discovery, each tangible proof that Alexander thought of her beyond the practical necessities of their arrangement. And she would read these volumes during her brief moments of rest, touching the pages with careful reverence and wondering if his hands had held these same books, if he had selected them himself from his extensive library, if he imagined her reading them as she indeed did, finding solace in the written word during the long evenings in her narrow room. Eleanor noticed other protections as well, subtler interventions that she might have attributed to chance had they not accumulated with such consistent pattern. And there was the morning when young Thomas, a footman known for his cruel tongue and wandering hands, had made an inappropriate comment about Eleanor's condition, only to be summarily dismissed from service that very afternoon. The Duke himself delivering the termination with a coldness that sent whispers through the servants' hall. And there was the day when Lady Ashford had ordered Eleanor to scrub the entrance hall floors on her hands and knees, a task clearly designed to humiliate, only to have Alexander intervene with icy politeness, suggesting his mother might prefer the regular staff handle such tasks as he had noticed the quality of work had declined recently. And Eleanor had watched this exchange from the shadows, understanding that he was protecting her while maintaining the fiction that separated them. She began to watch for him in the hallways with a new awareness, no longer dreading those brief encounters but instead finding herself listening for his footsteps, and she noticed how his gaze would sweep over her with what appeared to be casual disinterest to any observer, but lingered just long enough to assess her well-being, to ensure she carried nothing too heavy, to verify that she appeared healthy and rested. And once, when she had stumbled slightly on the stairs due to her shifting balance, his hand had shot out to steady her elbow with a speed that suggested his attention had been focused on her all along, and though he had released her immediately and continued on his way without a word, Eleanor had felt the warmth of that brief contact for hours afterward, like a brand against her skin. Her mind insisted this was merely the care any man would show toward the vessel carrying his heir, practical concern for his investment and nothing more, but her heart whispered dangerous alternatives, suggested that perhaps these small kindnesses revealed something Alexander himself might not yet acknowledge, and Eleanor found herself caught between the safety of cynical interpretation and the terrifying vulnerability of hope, understanding that to allow herself to believe these gestures meant more than expedience, was to risk a heartbreak far more devastating than anything she had yet endured, yet finding it increasingly impossible to maintain her emotional distance when every discovered book, every subtle protection, every lingering glance seemed to promise that perhaps she was not as alone in this strange arrangement as she had believed herself to be. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying roses as Eleanor slipped through the servants' entrance and made her way to the gardens, seeking the solitude she had been craving all day after enduring misses. Henderson's sharp commentary about her slowing pace, and the pitying glances of the younger maids who whispered that surely her time must be drawing near, and she moved carefully along the gravel paths toward the old stone bench beneath the ancient oak tree, where she had often retreated during her first months at the estate, before her condition had made such escapes more difficult and more noticed. The moon hung low and full above the estate, casting silver light across the formal hedges and illuminating the last stubborn blooms of autumn, and Eleanor lowered herself onto the bench with a sigh of relief, feeling the child shift within her as she settled, and she closed her eyes and allowed herself this moment of peace, this brief respite from the constant performance of servitude and the weight of secrets carried. But the sound of footsteps on gravel made her eyes fly open and her breath catch, because Alexander was walking toward her through the moonlight, his dark coat unbuttoned and his expression unreadable, and she moved to rise in deference, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Please," he said, his voice quiet in the garden's stillness, "do not stand on my account," and he gestured to the space beside her on the bench, a question in the gesture, and Eleanor nodded mutely, because what else could she do when her heart was suddenly beating so hard she feared he might hear it. And he sat with careful distance between them, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cooling evening air. They remained silent for a long moment, both gazing out at the moonlit gardens, and Eleanor wondered what had brought him here, whether he had followed her or merely happened upon her by chance, and the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, and she found herself speaking before she could think better of it, her voice emerging softer than she intended. "The gardens are beautiful in the moonlight," she said, offering the safest of observations, and Alexander turned to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch again. "Are you well?" he asked, bypassing her pleasantry entirely, and the directness of the question, the genuine concern in his tone, cracked something in Eleanor's carefully maintained composure, and she found herself answering with an honesty that surprised them both. "I am tired," she said, and the words felt like a confession, tired of pretending, tired of the whispers, tired of being something other than what I am. And she had not meant to say so much, had not intended to reveal the exhaustion that went beyond the physical demands of pregnancy and household work, but the words had escaped, and she could not call them back. Alexander's hands flexed on his knees, and she saw his jaw tighten as though he were suppressing some strong emotion, and when he spoke, his voice carried a roughness she had never heard before. "And the child?" he asked. "Does he—" and he paused, correcting himself. "Does the child seem well?" Eleanor placed a hand on her belly, feeling the strong kicks beneath her palm, and she nodded. "Very well," she said, "quite vigorous, in fact, particularly at night when I am trying to rest." And she had intended it as a simple report, but found herself almost smiling at the truth of it. And Alexander's expression softened in a way that transformed his usually severe features. "I had not intended," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words for the first time in Eleanor's memory, and she watched him in profile as he stared out at the gardens, his throat working as though the words he needed were lodged somewhere too deep to access easily. "I had not intended for this arrangement to be so difficult for you," he finally said. "I thought I had constructed something that would benefit us both without causing undue suffering, but I see now that I was naive in my assumptions, and that I did not fully comprehend what I was asking of you." And Eleanor felt her heart constrict, because his admission revealed a vulnerability she had not expected, a crack in the careful control he always maintained. "You gave me a choice when I had none," Eleanor said quietly, surprising herself with the gentleness in her tone. "Whatever hardships I endure now, they are preferable to what would have awaited me otherwise." And this was true, she realized as she spoke it. Despite everything, despite the gossip and the physical demands and the strange liminal existence she inhabited, this was still better than the destitution that had loomed before Alexander's proposal, and yet the acknowledgement felt incomplete, failed to capture the complexity of what she felt sitting here beside him in the moonlight, with their child moving between them. Alexander turned to face her fully, and the moonlight caught his eyes, and Eleanor saw in them something that made her pulse quicken, something that looked almost like longing but surely could not be. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "If I could change the circumstances," he said, "if I could give you more than this half-existence, I would." And the words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor found she could not look away from his face, could not break the connection that seemed to have formed in this quiet garden moment. And though neither of them moved closer, though the careful distance remained between them on the bench, Eleanor felt as though something fundamental had shifted, as though the ground beneath her understanding of their arrangement had begun to crack and reform into a new and terrifying landscape she did not yet know how to navigate. The dinner party arrived with the cold precision of a military campaign, Lady Ashford orchestrating every detail with the particular satisfaction of someone who had found the perfect opportunity to remind certain people of their place, and Eleanor had watched the preparations unfold over the preceding week with a growing sense of dread that she could not quite name, but felt in her bones, like the approach of winter. And when Mrs. Henderson informed her with barely concealed malicious pleasure that she would be required to serve during the event. Despite her advanced condition, Eleanor had known immediately that this directive had come from Lady Ashford herself, a deliberate cruelty designed to accomplish purposes Eleanor could only partially comprehend. The evening of the party found Eleanor dressed in the standard maid's uniform that no longer fit properly around her swollen belly, the fabric straining across her middle in a way that made her condition impossible to ignore, and she took her place among the serving staff, with her head held high and her hands steady, though her back already ached, and the child within her seemed to sense her distress and moved restlessly, pressing against her ribs in a way that made breathing difficult, and she watched as the guests arrived in their finery. Ladies in silk gowns and gentlemen in perfectly tailored evening clothes, and she felt the weight of their curious stares, heard the whispers that followed her movements through the dining room like a dark tide, and she understood that she had been positioned as a spectacle, a living cautionary tale about the wages of sin and the fall of foolish girls who forgot their station. Lady Ashford presided over the gathering with icy elegance, her sharp eyes following Eleanor's every movement with an intensity that suggested she was waiting for something, hoping for some misstep or sign of weakness, and she made certain to direct Eleanor to the most demanding tasks, insisting she carry the heavy soup tureen, despite protocol suggesting this duty should fall to the footman, requiring her to bend and reach and move with a speed that grew increasingly difficult. As the evening wore on, and her body protested the demands being placed upon it, and Eleanor complied with each instruction without complaint, her face a mask of serene compliance, even as her lower back screamed, and her ankles swelled, and the child kicked with what felt like objection to this treatment. The guests' conversation flowed around her like water around a stone, discussing politics and society gossip, and the upcoming season, and Eleanor heard her name mentioned more than once in tones that ranged from pitying to scandalized, heard one elderly dowager comment loudly that it was unseemly to have such a woman serving at a respectable table, heard another suggest that modern servants had no shame whatsoever, and she absorbed each barb with the practiced numbness she had developed over these months, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. But from across the room she felt Alexander's gaze like a physical touch, and when she dared glance in his direction, she saw that his jaw was clenched, so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek, saw his knuckles white where his hand gripped his wine glass, saw in his eyes a barely controlled fury that both frightened and strangely comforted her because it meant he saw what was happening, understood the calculated cruelty of his mother's actions, and cared enough to be enraged by it. The evening stretched endlessly, each course seeming to last an eternity, and Eleanor's vision began to blur slightly at the edges from exhaustion and pain, and when she bent to refill Lady Ashford's water glass, her hand trembled just slightly, just enough that a few drops splashed onto the white tablecloth, and Lady Ashford's voice cut through the dining room's pleasant murmur like a blade, sharp and cold, and designed to carry. "How clumsy," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I suppose we cannot expect much grace from those in such a condition, though one might hope for basic competence." And the table fell silent, all eyes turning to Eleanor, and she felt the weight of their judgment like a physical force pressing down upon her shoulders, and she murmured an apology and moved to dab at the spill with her cloth. But Lady Ashford waved her away with a gesture of disgust, and Eleanor straightened slowly, her back screaming in protest, and she met Alexander's gaze across the room, and saw in his eyes a promise of reckoning that made her breath catch, even as her body swayed with fatigue. And she understood in that moment that something irrevocable was building toward explosion, that the careful balance they had maintained could not hold much longer under the pressure of such deliberate cruelty, and that the consequences of whatever came next would transform everything. The summons came near midnight, delivered by a stone-faced footman who found Eleanor in the servants' quarters, where she had finally collapsed onto her narrow bed after the ordeal of the dinner party, every muscle in her body screaming with exhaustion, and her swollen feet throbbing with a pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. And the message was brief and formal. The Duke required her presence in his study immediately, and Eleanor's first instinct was fear, because such a summons at such an hour could mean nothing good, but she rose with difficulty and made her way through the darkened corridors of the sleeping house, her hand pressed to her aching back, and her breath coming short as she climbed the stairs to the wing, where Alexander's private rooms were located, a part of the manor she had never before entered, despite living under its roof for 2 years. The study door stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling into the hallway, and Eleanor knocked softly before entering to find Alexander standing by the fireplace with his back to her, and still dressed in his evening clothes, but with his jacket discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in a state of dishevelment she had never seen him permit. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, his face was haggard in a way that startled her, as though the evening had aged him years in the span of hours, and he crossed the room toward her, with swift strides that made her step back instinctively before she caught herself and held her ground. "Sit," he said, and his voice was rough with some emotion she could not name, and he gestured to the leather chair near the fire, and Eleanor wanted to protest that it was not proper for her to sit in his presence, but the words died in her throat when she saw his expression, and she lowered herself into the chair with a sigh of relief she could not suppress because her body had been begging for rest since the dinner party began. And Alexander knelt before her with a movement so sudden and unexpected that Eleanor gasped and tried to rise, but he placed his hands on the arms of the chair, caging her in, and said, "Please, allow me this." And before she could form a coherent response, he had lifted one of her swollen feet and begun unlacing her worn boot with fingers that trembled slightly, and the intimacy of the gesture, the shock of seeing the Duke of Ashford kneeling before her tending to her physical comfort, shattered something in Eleanor's carefully maintained composure, and she felt tears spring to her eyes unbidden. He removed both boots with gentle efficiency, and then his hands were on her stockinged feet, his thumbs pressing into the arch with a firm pressure that made her gasp again, but this time with relief as the tension began to ease, and neither of them spoke for long minutes while he worked, his head bent in concentration, and Eleanor watched him through her tears and wondered what transformation had occurred to bring them to this moment, what had changed between the garden conversation and tonight's humiliation that had broken through the walls they had both so carefully maintained. And finally Alexander spoke without looking up from his task, his voice low and strained. "I should never have allowed her to treat you that way," he said. "I should have stopped it the moment I understood what she intended, but I was afraid," and he broke off, his hands stilling on her feet, and Eleanor saw his jaw clench with the effort of forcing out words that clearly cost him dearly to speak. "Afraid of what?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and Alexander finally looked up at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch, because she saw in them not the cold control he usually maintained, but something wild and desperate and achingly vulnerable that transformed his severe features into something almost beautiful in its honesty. "Afraid that if I revealed how much it mattered to me," he said, "afraid that if I showed how deeply it wounded me to see you suffer, I would expose the truth that I have been trying to deny for months now. The truth that this arrangement we made has become something I never intended, something I am no longer certain I can contain or control." And his hands tightened on her feet as though anchoring himself, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs because his words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implications she both longed for and feared to acknowledge, and she found herself asking the question that had haunted her since their garden conversation, the question she had been too afraid to voice until this moment, when all pretense seemed to have been stripped away. "Why did you choose me?" she asked. "Not the arrangement itself, but why me specifically? There must have been other women in desperate circumstances who would have accepted your proposal, so why did you seek me out?" And Alexander's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pain, and his answer, when it came, was halting and incomplete. As though he were revealing only fragments of a larger truth, he was not yet ready to speak fully, but even those fragments were enough to set Eleanor's world tilting on its axis, because they hinted at depths she had not dared imagine, at motivations that went beyond mere practicality, into territory that made her heart ache with dangerous hope. The memory came to Alexander unbidden as he knelt before Eleanor in the firelight, her question hanging between them like a challenge he could no longer evade, and he found himself transported back 3 years to a cold January afternoon when he had first seen her, not as a prospective solution to his dilemma, but simply as a young woman standing in the village square with a basket of her father's belongings she was attempting to sell. Her face pale with grief and exhaustion, but her bearing somehow still dignified, despite the obvious desperation of her circumstances, and he had watched her from his carriage window as she negotiated with a merchant over the price of her father's pocket watch, watched her bite her lip to hold back tears when the offered sum was insultingly low, but accept it anyway because she had no choice. And something in that moment, in the way she squared her shoulders and forced herself to smile and thank the merchant, despite the indignity, had struck him with unexpected force, and he had found himself asking his driver who she was, learning that she was Eleanor Hartley, whose father had recently died, leaving nothing but debts, and he had dismissed the matter from his mind, or tried to, but over the following months he had seen her again in the village, always with that same quiet strength, that same refusal to collapse under the weight of circumstances that would have broken lesser souls, and he had observed her kindness to an elderly woman who had dropped her parcels, her patience with children who ran underfoot in the market, her gentle firmness with a young maid who was being harassed by a drunken stable hand, and these small moments had accumulated in his mind, like drops of water filling a vessel, until he could no longer pretend he had not noticed her, had not been drawn to something essential in her character that called to the parts of himself he kept most carefully hidden. Alexander's own childhood had been a masterclass in emotional deprivation. His father cold and demanding and satisfied only by perfection, his mother, Lady Ashford, even then equally frigid and consumed by social position and the maintenance of the family's reputation, above all considerations of warmth or affection, and he had learned early that love was a weakness to be avoided, that feelings were dangerous disruptions to the orderly conduct of life, and he had accordingly built walls around his heart, with the same precision his ancestors had used to build the Ashford estate, layer upon layer of stone meant to keep the world at a safe distance, and when the pressure to marry and produce an heir had become unbearable, he had revolted against the idea of trapping some innocent woman of his own class in the same loveless existence his parents had modeled, had refused to perpetuate that particular form of cruelty. And it was in this state of rebellion against expectation that the idea had first formed to find someone who needed rescue as much as he needed an heir, to create an arrangement that would be honest in its transactional nature, to protect them both from the false promises and inevitable disappointments of romantic entanglement. But even as he had formulated the plan, even as he had investigated Eleanor's circumstances and confirmed that she was indeed as desperate as she appeared, even as he had rehearsed the words he would use to propose this strange bargain, some part of him had known, though he had refused to acknowledge it, that his choice of Eleanor specifically was not as rational as he pretended, that he had selected her, not merely because she needed help, but because something in her character had already begun to work its way past his defenses, because he had watched her for months and had come to admire her in ways he could not quite articulate, and he had told himself that his feelings were merely respect, merely appreciation for her visible virtues, nothing more dangerous than that. But now, kneeling before her with her swollen feet in his hands, and her eyes searching his face for truth he could no longer deny, he understood that he had been lying to himself from the beginning, that he had chosen Eleanor not to keep his heart safe, but because his heart had already begun to choose her, and the arrangement he had constructed had been nothing more than an elaborate justification for bringing her into his life in the only way his pride and fear would permit, and this realization broke over him with the force of revelation, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The weeks that followed the night in Alexander's study brought a transformation so gradual that Eleanor could not identify the precise moment when the walls between them began to crumble, could not pinpoint the exact hour when their carefully maintained distance gave way to something warmer and infinitely more dangerous. But she felt the shift in 1,000 small ways that accumulated like snowfall, silent and inexorable, covering the landscape of their arrangement until its original shape became difficult to discern beneath the softness of what was growing between them. Alexander began appearing in the servants' wing with increasing frequency, always with some plausible excuse, a question about household management that could have been directed to the housekeeper, a book he claimed to have found that he thought might interest someone, though they both knew he meant her specifically, a concern about the adequacy of her quarters that required his personal inspection, and these visits stretched longer, each time as conversation overtook whatever pretext had brought him there, and Eleanor found herself sharing things she had never intended to reveal, telling him about her father's library that had been sold piece by piece to pay his debts, about the dreams she had harbored of perhaps teaching someday or writing, small aspirations that seemed foolish now, but that Alexander received with such genuine interest that she could not help but continue. And he in turn began to speak of his own lost possibilities, the man he might have been had he not been born into the crushing weight of duty and expectation. And these exchanges felt illicit in their intimacy, and more transgressive than their physical union had ever been, because they were choosing this closeness rather than enduring it as obligation. The books began appearing with greater regularity, rare volumes that must have cost him considerable effort to acquire, poetry and novels, and philosophical works that he somehow knew would speak to her particular sensibilities, and Eleanor would find them in her small room, with no note attached because none was needed, and she would read them late into the night by candlelight, with one hand pressed to her swelling belly and her heart full of an emotion she refused to name. And when next she saw Alexander, she would thank him with careful formality, but their eyes would meet and hold for seconds too long, and in those moments she could feel the air between them thicken with everything they were not saying, with all the words that hovered on the edge of speech, but remained trapped behind the fear of what speaking them might unleash. He brought her tea one afternoon, when he found her resting in the small parlor that the servants were permitted to use, carried the cup himself rather than sending someone else, and when he placed it in her hands, his fingers brushed against hers, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as propriety demanded. And Eleanor felt that brief contact like a spark that traveled up her arm and lodged somewhere near her heart, and she looked up to find Alexander watching her with an expression of such naked longing that it stole her breath. But then he masked it quickly and stepped back and asked about her health with studied casualness, and she answered in kind, though her voice trembled slightly, and they spoke of inconsequential things, while the real conversation happened in the spaces between words, in the way he could not seem to stop looking at her, in the way her hands shook as she lifted the teacup to her lips. The child moved within her one evening, while Alexander was helping her rise from a chair, his hand on her shoulder for support, and Eleanor gasped at the sudden flutter of movement, and without thinking she took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the baby was shifting and turning. And Alexander went very still, his palm warm through the fabric of her dress, and they stood frozen in that tableau for a long moment, while beneath his hand their child moved again. And Eleanor watched his face transform with wonder and something that looked almost like anguish, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, as he said, "Thank you for letting me feel that." And Eleanor understood that he was thanking her for more than just this moment, for more than just the child she carried, but for the gift of her presence in his life, for the way she had somehow made him capable of feeling things he had thought forever beyond his reach, and she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that she had fallen in love with him, hopelessly and irrevocably, despite every promise she had made to herself to keep her heart guarded, and the knowledge terrified her, because she had no assurance that what she felt was returned, no guarantee that his kindness was anything more than care for the mother of his heir, and yet she could not stop herself from hoping, could not prevent her heart from opening to him like a flower to the sun, and she knew that this hope would either save her or destroy her, and there was no way to know which until the moment of truth arrived. The storm arrived without warning on a Tuesday evening in late October, the sky darkening to charcoal, within moments, as wind tore through the estate grounds, with a violence that rattled windows and sent servants scurrying to secure shutters and doors, and Eleanor had been in her small room in the servants' wing when the first drops of rain struck the windows like thrown pebbles, quickly escalating to a deluge that hammered against the roof with deafening force, and she had been reading one of Alexander's latest gifts, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry that spoke of nature and solitude, and the quiet stirrings of the human heart, when she heard the ominous creak above her head, a groan of stressed timber that made her look up just as the first drops of water began to fall from the ceiling, darkening the plaster in spreading circles that grew larger with each passing second, until water was streaming steadily into her room, pooling on the floor and soaking into her few possessions with ruthless efficiency. She had gathered what she could salvage and fled into the hallway, where other servants were emerging from their quarters in similar states of alarm, the old roof finally succumbing to years of deferred maintenance in the least important wing of the house. And Eleanor had stood there with her arms full of books and her nightgown, and the small wooden box that contained her mother's locket and her marriage certificate and the few other items of value she possessed in the world, and she had felt suddenly overwhelmed by the precariousness of her situation, by how little she truly had, by how easily even these meager things could be swept away, and the baby had chosen that moment to move strongly within her as if in protest against the chaos, and she had pressed her free hand to her belly and tried to steady her breathing, while around her servants argued about where they would sleep and who was responsible for this disaster, and whether the Duke would even care that they were being flooded out like rats from a sinking ship. Alexander had appeared at the top of the stairs with such sudden authority that the cacophony of voices fell silent, his hair slightly disheveled from the wind and his expression carved from stone as he surveyed the scene before him. And his eyes had found Eleanor immediately among the crowd of displaced servants, had noted her wet hair and the way she was shivering slightly and the protective way she held her belongings against her chest, and he had descended the stairs with deliberate purpose and said in a voice that brooked no argument that arrangements would be made for everyone, that guest rooms would be opened, that the situation would be addressed immediately. But then his gaze had returned to Eleanor, and something in his expression had shifted, had gentled, and he had said quietly that she, in particular, could not remain in such conditions in her state, and before anyone could respond or protest or speculate further, he had reached out and taken her bundle of possessions from her arms and gestured for her to follow him, and Eleanor had hesitated for only a moment before obeying, aware of every eye upon her as she walked beside him through the corridors of the house, climbing to the second floor where the family quarters and guest rooms resided, places she had never been permitted to enter except to clean, and Alexander had opened the door to a room decorated in soft blues and creams, a space infinitely larger and more luxurious than anywhere she had ever slept, and he had set her things on a chair and turned to her with an expression that was almost apologetic, and said that she would stay here until her quarters could be properly repaired, and the household could speculate all they wished, but he would not have her sleeping in dampness and cold. Not now, not when she carried precious cargo, and his use of that phrase, precious cargo, had made Eleanor's heart twist, because she could not tell whether he meant the child alone or something more, and she had thanked him with careful formality, but their eyes had met and held, and in that moment the space between them had felt charged with electricity more potent than the storm raging outside, and then he had withdrawn and left her alone in this beautiful room that smelled of lavender and beeswax, and she had stood in the center of it, feeling displaced and uncertain, until hours later, when pain had seized her abdomen with such sudden violence that she had gasped aloud, and the contractions had come in waves that left her breathless and terrified, and she had managed to pull the servant's bell before collapsing onto the bed, and when Alexander had burst through the door minutes later, with the household physician trailing behind him, Eleanor had reached for his hand without thinking, and he had taken it and held it, and refused to leave even when the physician had suggested it might be more appropriate, and had stayed beside her through the examination and the tense hours that followed until the doctor had finally pronounced it. False labor brought on by stress and cold, the baby not yet ready to enter the world, and through it all, Alexander had held her hand and stroked her hair and murmured reassurances in a voice rough with emotion. And when the danger had passed and the physician had departed and the household had settled into uneasy sleep, he had remained in the chair beside her bed, their fingers still intertwined, and Eleanor had looked at him in the candlelight and seen such naked fear and relief on his face that she could no longer pretend to herself that what lay between them was merely obligation or convenience, and she had whispered his name, just his name, nothing more, and he had raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise, like a vow renewed, like the beginning of something neither of them could any longer deny. The morning light had barely begun to grey the windows when Lady Ashford's voice shattered the fragile peace of the guest room, her fury preceding her like a wave of ice as she swept through the door without knocking, her face contorted with an rage so pure and venomous that Eleanor sat up in bed with her heart hammering against her ribs, and the Dowager Duchess stood there in her morning dress with her hands clenched at her sides and her eyes blazing as she took in the scene. Eleanor in the fine bed, her few possessions arranged on the furniture, the lingering scent of the physician's medicines in the air, and her voice, when it came, was low and shaking with barely controlled wrath as she demanded to know by what presumption a common servant dared to occupy rooms reserved for the family's guests. What possible justification could exist for such an outrageous breach of propriety? And Eleanor had opened her mouth to explain about the storm and the damaged roof, but Lady Ashford had cut her off with a slashing gesture, declaring that she knew exactly what this was, that she was not blind to the disgraceful situation unfolding under her own roof, that it was clear Eleanor had seduced her son with her condition and her false vulnerability, had manipulated him into some misguided sense of responsibility, and the accusations poured forth like poison as Lady Ashford called her a scheming harlot, a low-born opportunist, a woman who had deliberately entrapped the Duke with her wiles and now sought to install herself above her station through manipulation and deceit. Eleanor had felt each word like a physical blow, had wanted to defend herself, but found the words trapped in her throat, because how could she deny what appeared to be true without revealing the secret that was not hers alone to tell, and she had simply sat there with her hands pressed protectively over her belly while Lady Ashford's tirade continued, the older woman's voice rising as she declared that Eleanor would be cast out immediately, that she would not spend another night under this roof, that her condition was her own fault and her own problem, and the Duke's misplaced charity had reached its end, and Eleanor had felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall, refused to give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her break, when Alexander's voice had cut through the room like a blade, cold and sharp, and carrying an authority that made even his mother pause mid-sentence, and Eleanor had looked up to see him standing in the doorway, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, as though he had never left the chair beside her bed, and his face was a mask of controlled fury as he stepped into the room and positioned himself between Eleanor and his mother with deliberate protectiveness. The confrontation that followed had been unlike anything Eleanor had witnessed, Alexander's voice never rising above a deadly calm as he informed his mother that Eleanor's presence in this room was by his direct order, that she would remain here as long as necessary, that his decisions regarding the management of his household were not subject to his mother's approval, and Lady Ashford had stared at him with something like shock before rallying with renewed venom, demanding to know what hold this common girl had over him, whether he had lost all sense of propriety and dignity, whether he intended to make himself a laughingstock by installing his pregnant mistress in the family wing, and at the word mistress, Alexander's jaw had tightened visibly, but still he had not revealed the truth, and had simply stated with Arctic precision that Eleanor was under his protection and would be treated with respect. And his mother had laughed then, a harsh and bitter sound, as she declared that respect must be earned, and this girl had earned nothing but contempt, that she would appeal to the family solicitors, that she would see Eleanor removed from the estate by force if necessary, and Eleanor had listened to them argue over her as though she were an object rather than a person, and had felt something inside her crack and splinter, and had realized with devastating clarity that she could not continue to be the source of such conflict between Alexander and his family, could not watch him defend her while still keeping her hidden like a shameful secret, could not bear to be the cause of this division that was tearing at him, even as he stood firm against his mother's assault. When Lady Ashford had finally swept from the room with a final venomous declaration that this matter was far from settled, Alexander had turned to Eleanor with an expression of such anguish and fury and helplessness that she had nearly broken her resolve, but then he had apologized as though any of this were his fault, and had asked if she was well, if the confrontation had harmed her or the baby, and Eleanor had assured him with false calm that she was fine, though inside she was making calculations and decisions that she knew would break both their hearts. And after he had left with obvious reluctance to attend to estate business that could not be delayed, Eleanor had sat in that beautiful room that now felt like a cage, and had understood with perfect clarity that she could not remain, that her presence was poison to this household, that the kindest thing she could do for Alexander was to release him from their arrangement and disappear before she caused him any more pain. And though the thought of leaving him made her feel as though she were tearing out her own heart, she knew it was the only way to spare him from having to choose between his family and his duty and whatever complicated feelings he might harbor for the woman who carried his child. Eleanor rose in the hours before dawn, when darkness still blanketed the estate, and the servants had not yet stirred from their quarters, moving through the guest room with methodical precision as she gathered the few possessions that belonged to her. The books Alexander had given her, wrapped carefully in her shawl, her mother's locket clasped around her neck, the wooden box containing her marriage certificate and the other fragments of her former life, the simple dresses that had been hers before. She had donned a maid's uniform, and as she packed, she felt a strange numbness settling over her heart, like frost crystallizing on glass, a protective barrier against the pain that threatened to overwhelm her if she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was doing. She had written the letter in the dead of night by the light of a single candle, her hand cramping as she struggled to find words adequate to the moment, to express gratitude without bitterness and release without recrimination. And in the end, she had written simply that she could not be the cause of division between him and his family, and that she released him from all obligations of their arrangement, that he had been kinder to her than she had any right to expect, and she would carry that kindness with her always, and she had signed it with just her Christian name because she could not bear to write Eleanor Ashford when that identity had never truly been hers to claim. She left the letter on the writing desk where he would find it, weighted down with the copy of Wordsworth he had given her, because she could not take that with her, could not carry a reminder of the life she was abandoning. And then she had slipped from the room and moved through the corridors of the great house like a ghost, touching nothing, leaving no trace of her passage except the whisper of her skirts against the floorboards and the irregular rhythm of her breathing, as the baby shifted restlessly within her, as though sensing her distress. The servants' entrance stood unlocked as it always did in the early morning hours when the kitchen staff began their preparations for the day, and Eleanor passed through it and out into the grey pre-dawn, where mist clung to the ground and the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and she had walked steadily down the long drive that curved through the grounds toward the main gates, her small bundle of possessions clutched against her chest, and her mind carefully empty of all thought, because to think would be to remember, and to remember would be to falter. She had reached the iron gates that marked the boundary between the estate and the wider world beyond, had actually placed her hand on the cold metal to push them open, when she heard her name called in a voice raw with something between fury and fear, and she had turned to see Alexander running toward her through the mist, with his shirt only half buttoned, and his hair wild, as though he had dressed in desperate haste, and the sight of him had made her heart constrict so painfully that she had pressed her free hand to her chest, as though she could physically hold herself together, and when he reached her he was breathing hard, and his eyes were blazing with an emotion she could not name, but that made her want simultaneously to run toward him and away from him. He demanded to know what she thought she was doing, where she imagined she could go in her condition, with nothing and no one to protect her, whether she had any conception of the danger she was courting by attempting to leave, and Eleanor had lifted her chin with as much dignity as she could muster and told him that she was releasing him from their bargain, that she would not be the source of conflict between him and his mother, that their arrangement had served its purpose and now she would remove herself, before she caused him further pain, and her voice had remained steady throughout this speech, though inside she felt as though she were shattering into pieces too small to ever be reassembled. And Alexander had stared at her with an expression of such profound incomprehension that she wondered if he had truly heard her at all. And then he had said in a voice that shook with suppressed emotion that she understood nothing, nothing at all, and that if she thought he would simply let her walk away, then she knew him far less than he had believed. The wind had risen with the dawn, and now whipped Eleanor's skirts around her legs, and tore strands of hair from her carefully pinned arrangement as she stood there at the gates with Alexander, before her and the vast unknown world in her back. And when she tried to explain again that she was doing this for him, that she could not bear to be the cause of his estrangement from his family, that their arrangement had always been temporary and now was simply ending sooner than anticipated, he had made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a groan, and had run his hands through his hair in a gesture of such profound frustration that she had taken an involuntary step backward, and he had said in a voice rough with emotion that she was a fool if she thought their arrangement had remained merely practical for him, that he had been protecting not just his unborn heir these past months, but the woman who had somehow managed to slip past every defense he had spent a lifetime constructing. And Eleanor had felt her breath catch in her throat as she stared at him with incomprehension, warring with a hope so fragile and terrifying that she dared not acknowledge it. And Alexander had continued speaking with words that seemed torn from him against his will, as he told her that he had not planned for this, had never intended to feel anything beyond duty and perhaps a distant affection, but that she had undone him with her quiet dignity and her fierce intelligence, and the way she had endured every humiliation without losing the essential goodness that radiated from her like light. And he confessed that he had fallen in love with his own wife without even realizing it was happening, and that somewhere between their stilted conversations and those moments when their eyes met across crowded rooms, and the nights when he had lain awake, wondering if she was comfortable or safe or thinking of him, he had lost his heart so completely that the thought of her leaving felt like death itself. Eleanor had stood frozen as his words washed over her, each syllable sinking into her consciousness like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch every corner of her being, and she wanted desperately to believe him, but the habit of self-protection was too deeply ingrained, the fear of being merely convenient or pitied too strong to be so easily dismissed, and she heard herself asking in a voice that shook whether this was truly love or simply guilt and responsibility, dressed in prettier language, whether he would still claim to care for her if she were not carrying his child, whether she was anything more to him than a problem to be solved and a duty to be fulfilled. And Alexander had closed the distance between them with 2 long strides, and had taken her face between his hands, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the intensity in his eyes, as he swore to her that the child had nothing to do with what he felt, that he would love her if she carried his heir, or if she came to him with nothing at all, that she had become essential to him in ways he could not fully articulate, but that he felt in every breath and every heartbeat. And then he had kissed her with a desperate tenderness that spoke of months of restraint finally breaking, and Eleanor had felt something inside her chest crack open like ice yielding to spring, releasing a flood of emotion she had been holding back since the moment she had agreed to this mad arrangement. And when they finally broke apart, she was crying and laughing simultaneously, while Alexander pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that he would never let her go, that she was his wife in truth now and forever, that he would stand before the world and claim her regardless of the consequences. Eleanor stood trembling in Alexander's embrace, with her face pressed against his chest, where she could hear the rapid thundering of his heart, and she wanted with every fiber of her being to surrender to the hope his words offered. But the voice of self-preservation whispered its insidious warnings about the folly of believing that love could truly spring from such calculating origins. And when she finally pulled back enough to look up at him, she found herself voicing the doubts that had tormented her through countless sleepless nights, asking him how she could be certain this was not merely guilt speaking or a sense of responsibility toward the mother of his child, rather than genuine affection for the woman herself, questioning whether he would feel this way if circumstances had been different, if she had not been carrying the heir he so desperately needed, if she had come to him as simply Eleanor with nothing to offer but herself. And the words tumbled from her lips in a rush of fear and longing, as she confessed that she had spent 2 years guarding her heart against precisely this outcome, because she had known from the beginning that to love him would be to court devastation, that she had observed him from her position as servant and wife in secret, and had seen his kindness and intelligence and the loneliness he tried so hard to conceal, and despite every rational argument she had constructed to protect herself, she had fallen in love with him anyway, slowly and helplessly, like a leaf spiraling down from an autumn tree. And now that he stood before her, claiming to return those feelings, she found herself paralyzed by terror, that this was an illusion that would shatter the moment she truly believed in it, leaving her more broken than if she had simply walked away when she had the courage. Alexander had listened to this outpouring with an expression that shifted from pain to tenderness, to something that looked remarkably like wonder, and when she finally fell silent, he took her hands in his and held them against his chest, where she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. And he began to speak in a voice stripped of all pretense and artifice, as he told her about the first time he had truly seen her, not as the desperate young woman accepting his devil's bargain, but as Eleanor herself, and he described how it had been a morning several months after their wedding, when he had passed through the servants' hall and found her comforting one of the younger maids who had received news of her mother's illness, and he had witnessed the genuine compassion in Eleanor's voice, and the way she had given the girl the coins she had been saving for herself so the child could return home. And he confessed that in that moment something had shifted in his perception of her, and he had begun to notice other things. The way she moved through the household, bringing quiet comfort wherever she went, the books she borrowed from the library revealing a mind hungry for knowledge and beauty, the dignity with which she bore every slight and humiliation without becoming hardened or bitter, and he admitted that he had fallen in love with her gradually, and then suddenly all at once, when he realized that she possessed everything he had never known he needed, that she had shown him what it meant to be truly good, in a world that had taught him only duty and position mattered, and his voice broke slightly as he swore to her that the child had nothing to do with his feelings, except perhaps to give him the excuse he needed to finally acknowledge what had been growing in his heart for months, and he promised that even if she had never conceived, even if their arrangement had yielded nothing but the connection between them, he would still be standing here, begging her not to leave him, because somewhere in the past 2 years she had become the very center of his existence, and he could not imagine continuing without her. They walked back to the manor together with the wind at their backs, and Eleanor's hand clasped firmly in Alexander's, as though he feared she might vanish. If he loosened his grip, and when they entered through the main entrance rather than the servants' door, the footman's eyes widened in barely concealed shock, though he said nothing, as Alexander led her through the grand hallway with its portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to stare down in judgment at this breach of every social convention, and Eleanor felt her courage beginning to waver as the reality of what was about to happen settled over her like a heavy cloak. But Alexander's steady presence beside her and the determined set of his jaw told her there would be no retreat from this moment, no return to the careful pretense that had governed their existence for 2 years. He sent word through the house that every member of the household staff was to assemble immediately in the great hall, and within a quarter hour they had gathered in a confused and whispering mass, housemaids and footmen and kitchen staff and groundskeepers, all standing in awkward clusters while exchanging bewildered glances and speculative murmurs, and Eleanor could feel their eyes upon her as she stood beside Alexander at the front of the room, could see the barely disguised contempt on some faces and the curiosity on others, and when Lady Ashford swept into the hall with her black silk skirts rustling and her expression already hardening into lines of displeasure, Eleanor felt her stomach clench with an old familiar fear. Alexander waited until his mother had taken her place and until the last whisper had died away into expectant silence, and then he began to speak in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the vast room, as he told them that he had summoned them to correct a grave deception that had been perpetrated not by malice but by necessity, and he explained in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that Eleanor was not and had never been merely a servant in his household, but was in fact his lawfully wedded wife, married in the sight of God and by the authority of the Church 2 years prior, and that the child she carried was the legitimate heir to the Ashford name and fortune. The room erupted into gasps and exclamations and shocked whispers that built into a roar of disbelief, and Eleanor watched as faces she had known for 2 years transformed with the news, some showing dawning comprehension of the strange protections she had enjoyed, others revealing embarrassment at the gossip they had spread and the slights they had delivered to one who was in truth their mistress. And through it all Lady Ashford stood frozen, with her face drained of color except for 2 spots of crimson high on her cheeks, and when the initial tumult had died down enough for her to be heard, she said in a voice that shook with fury that this was impossible, that she would never accept such a mockery of their family's honor, that a common servant could not simply be elevated to duchess by the speaking of a few words, and Alexander had turned to face his mother with an expression of such cold authority that even Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as he informed Lady Ashford that the marriage was legal and binding and had been from the moment that vows were spoken, that Eleanor would be acknowledged as the Duchess of Ashford and accorded every respect due to that position, and that any member of the household who could not accept this reality was free to seek employment elsewhere, and his tone made it abundantly clear that this applied equally to his mother as to the lowest scullery maid. Lady Ashford's eyes blazed with a rage so profound that Eleanor instinctively took a step backward, but Alexander moved slightly to place himself between his wife and his mother as Lady Ashford pronounced in a voice dripping with venom that he had brought shame upon their name, and that she would never forgive this betrayal, and then she had turned and swept from the hall with her spine rigid and her head held high in a pantomime of wounded dignity, leaving behind a household in complete disarray, and an Eleanor who could scarcely believe that the secret she had guarded so carefully had been laid bare before dozens of witnesses, transforming her existence in the space of minutes from hidden disgrace to acknowledged legitimacy. The days following Alexander's public declaration unfolded with a strangeness that left Eleanor feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life, for the servants who had whispered behind their hands about her fallen state now curtsied when she passed and addressed her as "Your Grace," with voices that trembled between shock and embarrassment, and she found herself moved from the cramped attic room she had occupied into the Duchess's suite with its silk wallpaper and windows overlooking the rose gardens, surrounded by luxury that felt simultaneously like her birthright reclaimed and an elaborate costume she had no right to wear. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had once assigned Eleanor the most menial tasks with barely concealed contempt, now appeared each morning with downcast eyes to inquire what her grace required for the day, and Eleanor could see in the woman's posture the uncomfortable recognition that she had treated her true mistress as little better than a scullery maid, though Eleanor found she possessed no desire for retribution and instead spoke to the staff with the same gentle courtesy she had always employed, which seemed to disconcert them more than anger would have done. Lady Ashford had retreated to the dowager's wing of the estate and refused all contact with either her son or his acknowledged wife. Her fury, a palpable presence that hung over the household like storm clouds, and the servants navigated carefully between their duties to the new Duchess and their awareness that the dowager still wielded considerable influence despite her displaced position, creating an atmosphere of uneasy transition where old hierarchies crumbled slowly and new ones had yet to fully form. Alexander seemed determined to leave no doubt about Eleanor's status, and he arranged for her to be presented formally to the local gentry at a dinner party where she sat at the head of the table in a gown of deep blue silk that had been hastily commissioned from the finest dressmaker in London, and she had felt every eye upon her as Alexander introduced her as his wife, with a pride that made her throat tighten with emotion. Though she could see the speculation and judgment in the faces of those assembled, the whispered questions about where this mysterious Duchess had come from and why her existence had been concealed. Yet despite these public demonstrations of Alexander's commitment and the material transformation of her circumstances, Eleanor found herself lying awake in her grand new bed with her hand pressed against the swell of her belly, tormented by the fear that this elevation was temporary, that some word or action would shatter the illusion, and she would find herself cast back into servitude, or worse, and she could not quite believe that the future she had imagined in her most secret dreams had become reality simply because Alexander had spoken the truth aloud. He seemed to sense this uncertainty in her, and he took to spending his evenings in her sitting room, reading to her or simply talking about the estate's business, treating her not as an ornament to be displayed, but as a partner whose opinion he genuinely valued. And gradually, Eleanor began to recognize that his attentiveness was not performance for the benefit of watching servants, but rather the expression of a devotion that had been growing in concealment for months and could now finally manifest, without constraint. And when he took her hand and pressed it to his lips with a tenderness that made her breath catch, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, impossibly, their strange beginning had transformed into something real and lasting. The winter storm arrived in December with a fury that rattled the windows of Ashford Manor and sent snow swirling in great white curtains across the grounds, and Eleanor woke in the hours before dawn with a tightening across her belly that she knew immediately was different from the false pains she had experienced months before, and when she called softly for Alexander in the darkness, he was beside her in an instant, with his hand pressed gently to where their child moved restlessly beneath her skin, and he sent for the midwife and the physician, with an urgency that brooked no delay, despite the storm that made the roads nearly impassable. The labor progressed slowly through the grey morning and into afternoon, while the wind howled like something wild and untamed, and Alexander defied every convention and expectation by refusing to leave Eleanor's side, even when the midwife suggested with scandalized delicacy that perhaps his grace would be more comfortable waiting elsewhere, but he simply fixed the woman with a look that ended all protest and returned his attention to Eleanor, holding her hand through each contraction and whispering encouragement when the pain grew so intense that she could not contain her cries. The hours blurred together in a haze of agony and exhaustion, and there were moments when Eleanor feared she would not survive this ordeal, when the pain became so all-consuming that she could think of nothing beyond the next breath and the desperate need for it to end. But each time despair threatened to overwhelm her, she would feel Alexander's hand tightening around hers and hear his voice cutting through the fog of suffering to anchor her to the present moment, and she drew strength from his unwavering presence, even as she recognized dimly that his face had gone pale with fear for her. As evening approached and the storm reached its peak, the physician began to speak in low, urgent tones about complications and dangers, and Eleanor saw something like terror flash across Alexander's features before he mastered himself and bent close to tell her that she was the strongest person he had ever known, and that he believed in her completely, and somehow those words gave her the will to gather her remaining strength for one final tremendous effort. And then suddenly the pressure and pain transformed into a different sensation entirely, and the midwife was exclaiming with relief and presenting them with a tiny red-faced creature who announced her arrival into the world with a lusty cry that seemed to fill the entire room. Alexander took the baby with hands that trembled slightly as the midwife wrapped her in soft blankets, and Eleanor watched through tears of exhaustion and overwhelming emotion as he held their daughter for the first time, saw the way his expression transformed into something she had never quite seen before, a profound tenderness mixed with wonder and fierce protectiveness, and when he carefully placed the child in Eleanor's arms and bent to press his lips to her forehead, she understood with absolute certainty that whatever doubts had lingered in the shadows of her heart were groundless, that the devotion she saw in his eyes as he looked at both wife and child was real and unshakable, and would endure beyond the span of their mortal lives. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of new life, while the winter storm raged impotently outside, she finally allowed herself to believe completely in the improbable miracle of their love. Spring arrived at Ashford Manor with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the transformation occurring within its walls, and as the gardens burst into bloom with daffodils and early roses, Eleanor found herself standing at her bedroom window with their daughter Catherine, cradled against her shoulder, watching Alexander below as he consulted with the head gardener about plans to restore the long-neglected eastern gardens, and she marveled at how completely her life had been remade in the months since that winter birth, when everything had changed irrevocably. Her confidence as Duchess had grown steadily through the careful navigation of social calls and dinner parties, where she met the scrutiny of the local gentry, with a quiet dignity that gradually won even the most skeptical to grudging respect, and she discovered within herself a capacity for managing the great household that surprised her, for the years spent observing from her position as a servant had taught her more about the estate's workings than any formal education could have provided, and Alexander increasingly sought her counsel on matters both domestic and financial, valuing her practical insight in ways that made her feel truly his partner rather than merely his wife in name. The evenings had become Eleanor's most treasured time, when Alexander would finish his business for the day and join her in the sitting room where she nursed Catherine, while he read aloud from whatever book had captured their mutual interest, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of poetry or the drama of a novel, while their daughter dozed contentedly, and Eleanor felt surrounded by a peace she had never imagined possible during those dark days when she had scrubbed floors and endured whispers, and sometimes he would set aside the book and simply talk with her about his hopes for the estate's future or his memories of childhood loneliness, sharing confidences that bound them ever closer in understanding and affection. There were moments of pure domesticity that moved Eleanor beyond words, like the afternoon when she discovered Alexander lying on the nursery floor making ridiculous faces to coax smiles from Catherine, and his dignity as Duke entirely abandoned in favor of fatherhood's joys. Or the morning when he brought her breakfast in bed not because she was ill, but simply because he wished to see her face when she woke, and these small gestures of love felt more precious than any grand romantic declaration, because they spoke of a devotion woven into the fabric of daily life, rather than existing only in extraordinary moments. Lady Ashford remained in self-imposed isolation in the Dowager's quarters, her silence a constant reminder of the price Alexander had paid for choosing Eleanor over his mother's approval, yet he never expressed regret, and indeed seemed lighter without the weight of her expectations pressing down upon him, and Eleanor sometimes caught him watching her with an expression of such profound contentment that she understood their unconventional beginning had led them to a happiness neither could have found through traditional paths. And when he took her hand during their evening walks through the awakening gardens and told her that she had taught him what it meant to truly live rather than merely exist, she finally released the last shadows of doubt and allowed herself to inhabit completely the role of beloved wife, knowing that the love between them had been earned through patience and courage and tested by adversity until it had been forged into something unbreakable and true. 2 years after that momentous day when Alexander had revealed the truth before the assembled household, Eleanor stood in the drawing room of Ashford Manor, with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that looked out upon gardens now restored to their former glory, and she watched as Alexander knelt on the carpet-building towers of wooden blocks with Catherine, who had grown into a bright-eyed child of nearly 3 with her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle disposition, and Eleanor's hand rested unconsciously on the swell of her belly, where a second child grew strong and active. This pregnancy so different from the first because she carried it openly as the Duchess she had always been, surrounded by love rather than secrecy and shame. The estate had been transformed in these years, not merely in its physical aspects, though the gardens bloomed more beautifully than they had in decades, and the house itself seemed warmer and more welcoming, but in the very atmosphere that pervaded its halls, where servants went about their duties with contentment rather than fear, and guests remarked upon the unusual harmony that existed between the Duke and Duchess, a partnership of genuine affection that defied the conventions of marriages made for duty and advantage. And Eleanor sometimes caught herself marveling at the improbable journey that had brought her from that desperate young woman, accepting an impossible bargain, to this moment of complete domestic happiness. Catherine's laughter rang out as her tower of blocks tumbled down, and Alexander scooped her up with exaggerated dismay before setting her on his shoulders, and Eleanor felt her heart overflow with a joy so profound it bordered on pain. This beautiful, ordinary moment, worth more than all the grand balls and social triumphs that had marked her acceptance into society, and when Alexander met her eyes over their daughter's head, she saw reflected there the same wonder and gratitude that she herself felt, the shared understanding that they had been granted something rare and precious that might easily have been lost if either had been less brave or patient. Dear listener, there are truths about love that cannot be learned from poetry or romance, lessons that reveal themselves only through the patient accumulation of days and the courage to remain open to transformation, even when circumstances seem to decree otherwise. For Eleanor and Alexander's story teaches us that the human heart possesses a remarkable capacity to find connection in the most unlikely soil, that arrangements born of necessity and desperation can evolve into bonds of genuine devotion if both parties possess the wisdom to recognize what is growing between them and the bravery to nurture it despite all obstacles. Their love was not the lightning strike of fairy tales, but rather the slow, patient unfurling of two souls, learning to trust and reveal themselves to one another, built upon small kindnesses and quiet conversations, and the gradual dissolution of walls erected for protection. And perhaps this kind of love, earned rather than instant, tested by adversity and refined by time, proves more enduring than passion that ignites quickly and burns itself out just as fast. So if you find yourself in circumstances that seem designed to preclude happiness, if you have accepted limitations on your heart because you believed you had no other choice, remember that transformation remains possible even in the most constrained situations, that patience and courage and the willingness to see beyond surfaces can reveal depths you never imagined existed, and that love, when it finally arrives, cares nothing for the propriety of its origins, but only for the authenticity of the connection it creates. May you find the courage to remain open to unexpected possibilities. May you grant yourself permission to hope, even when hope seems foolish, and may you discover in your own life those small moments of grace that accumulate into something transformative and true. Now rest well, dear listener, and remember that every ending holds within it the seeds of a new beginning. And this story is brought to you by Tales of Heart, where we believe in the enduring power of love to remake even the most broken circumstances into something whole and beautiful.